I totally agree with you that CPTSD diagnostic criteria should include emotional abuse and emotional neglect, in my opinion. But yeah, the book that I was reading from did not include that. Something that I think is important to recognize in this context is that the book is old. Um, so it was saying that they were proposing this diagnostic criteria for the DSM-4, and the DSM-4 came out in 1994. So this would have predated that. So we're talking 30 years ago. And in a way that like 30 years is a long time, but also it's not. But it is a long time in terms of how psychology has come along to understanding trauma. Part of what this same book that the diagnostic criteria came from talks about is that for a long time we thought that trauma was exclusive to combat. We thought that even like soldiers who go to war but aren't like actively involved with combat couldn't develop what we now call PTSD. And it wasn't until the 70s that psychology started to recognize that grape caused the same thing, that it could cause PTSD or PTSD-like symptoms. And so then, and by the way, that understanding came out because of the women's movement first. It really, the credit goes to the women's movement rather than psychology discovering this independently. But anyway, like as depressing as that is to think that it's only been since the 70s that we understood that grape could cause PTSD for victims or survivors, it kind of puts into context like, well, of course, at that same time, we wouldn't have recognized that physical abuse, emotional neglect would be included just because stereotypically we see those things as lesser than grape, right? And I don't at all mean to say that they actually are less. I think it's one of those things you can't compare, but I think societally or whatever, we definitely see emotional abuse and emotional neglect as way more minor than physical abuse or sexual abuse for whatever reason. And so, yeah, it seems to me like at the time that this book was written, they weren't fully recognizing that emotional abuse and emotional neglect were part of that, unfortunately. I've also read The Body Keeps the Score, and the author of that book proposes a somewhat similar condition that he's tried getting into the DSM as well. His is developmental trauma based. I had to grab my book and look it up, but yeah, his is proposed for being called developmental trauma disorder, but it has a fair amount of overlap, in my opinion, with what CPTSD has, especially for people who had it as children, because the developmental trauma is for people who are experiencing traumatic environments while developing, while CPTSD, you could have a great childhood that is effectively trauma-free, but then experience CPTSD in adulthood. So they're different, but there's definitely a lot of overlap. But his has been unsuccessful at getting it approved to be included in the DSM as well. And in my opinion, it is always a real shame when emotional abuse or emotional neglect get left out of conversations, because I think those are extremely prevalent in society. I think in a lot of like kind of segments of culture, it's still very normalized to like promote the emotional neglect of children as like necessary to like avoid raising spoiled kids or to avoid letting them wear the pants or whatever. So I think as like society, we have a lot of people with CPTSD from emotional neglect, but who maybe were never like physically punished or physically abused at all, didn't have any SA, etc. And so I think those people are particularly at risk for having their trauma invalidated or just having no idea that they have trauma. And I think that's really unfortunate. It's my belief that not having emotional support from your parents as children makes any difficulties that you go through that much more likely to be traumatizing. Like the biggest factor for resilience is having a really supportive, emotionally connected like community. And as a kid, that kind of really needs to be your parents. So if we don't recognize emotional neglect and emotional abuse, I don't know, it just overlaps so much with other traumas too.